This is going to be an interactive session, so please feel free, but just make sure that you don't disrupt the speaker. All right, I believe we have the recording going now. So just a little bit of an introduction of Dr. Agaku. Dr. Agaku is an adjunct faculty at the University of California in San Francisco for close to a decade. He served as a senior scientist at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that is the CDC. He completed his dental training at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and his dental public health residency at the U.S. National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. He holds a master's degree in public health from Harvard University and 2 PhDs in epidemiology and health systems. Dr. Agaku is also the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Tobacco-Induced Diseases. He has authored over 160 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals and has served as the associate editor for the U.S. Surgeon General's report. Dr. Agaku is a diplomate of the American Board of Dental Public Health, and he's an expert in data science and artificial intelligence. He's also the founder, CEO, and chief scientific officer of Chisquares, a startup that is focused on building cutting-edge scientific tools. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Israel Agaku. Over to you, Dr. Agaku.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Obadan. Let me quickly pull up my slides and we'll be on our way. Okay. Just a sec. Okay, let's see. What can you see? Can you see my slides?
Yes, but not in presenter view. So if
okay, great. Let me now move to that mode.
Okay.
Let's see. You should see the full layout now. Awesome. All right, so we'll try and distill the art and science of designing national surveillance systems today. Obviously, like the title says, it's both a science and an art. What that simply means is that if you bring 10 survey designers into the room and you ask them to give you 10 designs, or you ask them for a survey, you're going to get 20 suggestions. And none of those will be wrong per se. So there is an art form to it as well. So the goal is not to make all of you experts in survey design today. As Dr. Badan mentioned, this will be one of a series of courses. What we hope to do today is to give you a very high-level picture of the entire process, like how the soup is made from the very, very high level. And then in subsequent classes, we'll then dive deeper into the nuances of design. So, but hopefully with what you learned today, you should be able to at least have an idea to be able to design a surveillance system by your own. In addition to the rules that Dr. Badon mentioned, please, I will add another rule. Kindly desist from scribbling things on the screen, as that is quite distracting. Thank you very much. All right, so let's first of all make a distinction between a survey and a surveillance system. Of course, we've heard of the word surveys. How is that distinct from a surveillance system? Well, here is what we think of when we think of a survey. We think of a one-time data collection being done to use that data for whatever it is we want to use it for, right? So that is what a cross-sectional survey would look like. A surveillance system builds upon that, in that the data collection might involve a survey, but it's not just a one-time thing. So the distinguishing feature of a surveillance system is the fact that it is an ongoing system. It's not just a one-time thing. If you just have a one-time survey, then, well, it's not a surveillance system per se. For it to be a true surveillance system, it has to be ongoing, right? So imagine that we collected a survey here, but we'll come back again next year, and there's an intention to keep that going for a very long time. That is what makes a surveillance system. So here we have a repeated survey. A repeated survey is here we have this group of individuals who are surveyed at time 1. Then we'll come to time 2, and we'll get another group of individuals. They may not necessarily be the same people as in the first group. So think of surveys like NHANES or the National Youth Tobacco Survey. When we go from year to year, it's not necessarily the same individuals that are being surveyed from one year to the other, but we call those repeated surveys. So those are different people, different times, but same population, and typically same indicators. So that's surveillance system. But we could also have another dimension to surveillance where we have longitudinal surveys. In this case, it's the same individuals being followed from time to time. So when you think of surveillance systems like SEER, the surveillance database for cancer, we're following the same individuals over time to see long-term outcomes, right? So whether it's a repeated survey, which is different points in time, different individuals, but same indicators, or it's longitudinal surveys where we have the same people being followed over time. The key point is that when we have surveillance systems, the intent is never just a one-time thing. The goal is to have an ongoing system where we collect data for the purpose of planning or public health practice or whatever the end goal might be. So that's a distinction we want to understand right from the start regarding the distinction between the survey in general and the surveillance system. When you're designing a surveillance system, because that's the key crux of this webinar series, it's not necessarily surveys per se, but surveillance system. So we need to understand what is involved from the perspective of architecture. If you are the product architect and you have been assigned to design a surveillance system, obviously the kind of things you will have to think about will be more than just designing a one-time survey. You have to think about continuity and sustainability, right? And so there are a whole lot of other logistical elements that would go into designing a surveillance system that you would otherwise not think about if it were just a one-time survey. For example, you have to think about stakeholders. Very important. This is not necessarily science per se, but without stakeholders, that element of continuity might be lost. So we need to think about stakeholders. We need to think about how we're going to describe the system. How do we present it in a way that stakeholders will understand and that funders would also understand why we're doing it. When we design an evaluation, a surveillance system, we need to evaluate the surveillance system year in, year out. So we don't want a scenario where we start a system and then 5 years down the line, it is not doing what it was intended to do. So as you're designing a surveillance system, you need to also think of how do we build an evaluation framework into that system. And then lastly, credible evidence, which is where the science is. From a scientific perspective, how do we design and implement the surveillance system in a way that is fit for use and fit for purpose? We're going to talk about each of those things and then spend a lot of time on the last element, which is credible evidence or the science of the design. So stakeholders could be any number of agencies or entities. It could be federal agencies, it could be boards of education, or whoever the case might be. The stakeholders are simply individuals who have a stake in the surveillance system. So it could be, for most of our surveys in the federal government, you have federal, non-federal, and the public. Those are our stakeholders. For your surveillance system, it might be different. It might be, people who work in the market. It might be parents. It might be teachers. But you need to identify who the stakeholders are and engage them early so that they can have an input in that. You also need to sit down and craft a description for your surveillance system. You can use the interrogative pronouns: who, what, where, when, and why. You should be able to answer each of those questions regarding what your surveillance system is designed to do, right? So put it on. It doesn't have to be pages upon pages of information. A one-pager will suffice, but it should be able to answer each of those interrogative pronouns. Who have been surveyed? What is the purpose of the study? And what is the sampling methodology? Where are the target population living? When is it going to be conducted? Why are we doing this? That's very important. So you should be able to answer each of those systems or those questions when you're designing a surveillance system. And then next, you need to have key indicators. The reason why we are setting up a surveillance system is because we want to measure things of interest over a long time, right? And so you should be able to sit down and say, in this surveillance system, what are the short-term outcomes? What are the intermediate outcomes? And what are the long-term outcomes? And so carefully articulating each of those is very important because that helps you to keep all stakeholders on board and makes sure that what you're eventually going to capture in the questionnaire reflects the intended purpose of the surveillance system. Now, credible evidence, this is the fourth and very most important element of designing a surveillance system. This is where the science comes in. The previous elements were mostly about the logistics and the art of convening people together to meet a particular purpose. With credible evidence, this is where we talk about the science of the design. So here we're talking about things like simplicity, flexibility. Simplicity means that, well, you realize that at the end of the day, it's human beings that will answer this question. So you don't want to make this super complicated. You want it to be as simple as possible to meet the intended purpose. Flexibility means, to what extent does this surveillance system, to what extent can it adapt to changing needs in information? Because no system is hard-coded. Today, we might need some information, and then tomorrow we might need another set of information. To what extent would you allow your surveillance system to have that flexibility baked into it so that it can capture new data needs? Now, while you want your system to be flexible, you also want it to be stable. So you can think of flexibility and stability as opposites of each other. If a surveillance system keeps changing every single year, then maybe it's not a surveillance system. If you have very drastic changes in the surveillance system in a manner that you cannot evaluate long-term trends, then that means that the surveillance system is not very stable. And this is the problem, the crisis facing US surveillance systems now, with changes that have been requested by the powers that be, that okay, you cannot have certain construct assessed. It means that most of the surveillance systems will have to be overhauled to meet the executive order, which means that they're not very stable. So stability means that year in, year out, there should be some elements of your surveillance system that should be stable and unchanging. And the way we try to meet the two contrasting needs is to have a core component of a surveillance system that does not change. And then we have rotating elements that we can swap out, right? So the core element, however, remains fixed. And then the rotating elements could be changed to adapt to changing needs in information. And so that way we ensure that it is flexible yet stable, because those are opposite things on the scale. Data quality is very important. It doesn't help us if we collect data in a way that is fast and rapid, but the data are pure nonsense. Data has to be fit for use and fit for purpose. So those are two cardinal questions we ask of ourselves. Are the data fit for use? And are they fit for purpose? Remember that the surveillance system was designed to meet a particular purpose. So it must meet that purpose. Then the acceptability is essentially, to what extent is the surveillance system accepted by stakeholders? And obviously, the participants are also the stakeholders. It doesn't help you if all stakeholders agree that it's a great idea, but the participants refuse to participate. Well, you don't have a surveillance system. So the surveillance system's acceptability includes all parties in question, especially the end participants, who are the ones who are providing the answers to these questions. The predictive value positive and the sensitivity are related. In other words, is what you're capturing the truth, right? And this goes to the heart of what kind of measures are we using in our surveillance system? Are we using self-reported measures? Can we use objective measures? How do we reduce misclassification? And those are all things that we need to consider when we design our surveillance system. Representativeness is extremely important. And this boils down to, what is the intended purpose of this surveillance system? What is the intent? Is the intent to create generalizable knowledge? Well, if the intent is to create generalizable knowledge, then we need to make sure that it is representative. And we're going to talk more about this in next few slides. And then timeliness, extremely important. This is where public health struggles a lot. We conduct surveys or surveillance systems today. 3 years later or 4 years later is when we now get the data. So the problem is that the data is always trailing reality by 4 years or 5 years, right? In an ideal world, you should be able to make use of that data the same year it was collected, right? So if we conducted a survey in 2025, well, we should be able to make use of that data in that same year so that the data informs real-time evidence, because that's the whole point. How do we change policy? How do we implement evidence-based practices? If the data are outdated, then it means then that what we're implementing is not based on current evidence per se, but it's based on evidence from 5 years ago or 4 years ago. So those are the requirements. And for dental public health trainees, the goal would be that you will take a surveillance system and you will evaluate it. So when I was in the Epidemic Intelligence Service at CDC, one of the requirements for EIS officers was that you evaluate a surveillance system. So you take a surveillance system and you evaluate it based on those 4 parameters we mentioned earlier, including stakeholders and up to credible evidence. And so this is what we'll expect the officer to do, right? And say on simplicity, I'm going to rate this as 5 stars because of so and so reason. On flexibility, I'm going to rate it on so and so. And so for every public health trainee, there's a minimum expectation that you would know how to evaluate a surveillance system. Now, this session is primarily intended for dental public health residents. So some of my statement might be directed primarily at the target audience, but I think there's still relevance to others who are part of public health, especially if you're a trainee. The expectation is that at the minimum, you should understand surveillance systems and be able to evaluate one should you have the opportunity to do so. So from a perspective of now implementing one, let's just zoom in, because a surveillance system at its very basic is formed by individual surveys. So if we understood how to conduct a survey, perhaps we'll be able to string them together and know how to conduct a broader surveillance system. So for the rest of the session, we're just going to focus on a survey, which is a single unit of a surveillance system, and say, all right, how do we go about designing the survey in a way that makes it fit for use and fit for purpose? So there are some key questions you must sit down with yourself and ask yourself, not ask somebody else, ask yourself before you start designing the survey. And the very first question is, what are my intentions as far as generalizability? Do I intend to generalize the data to the whole country, or do I have no intention to generalize? That's very important. The fact that it's a national survey does not necessarily mean that it is representative, right? So that's the very first thing. And that you are the only one who can answer that question, because this is purely based on your intention, on what you need the data for. So that's the first key question we need to ask. What are my intentions? Number 2, what is my budget? All right, very important. This is not a scientific question, but it's super, super important, because at the end of the day, the world runs on money. You can have all the noble intentions in the world, but without money, you can't do much. So now you can conduct a national survey with $0. You can also conduct a national survey with $100 million. The difference will be the kind of things you can incorporate, the complexity of a survey, obviously. And so that's why it's very important. We would, for this study, we'll be assuming that you have a very, very small budget to design the survey. And we'll talk about how then you can do that with a very tiny budget, because with that budget, then there are some things that are an absolute no-no, that we can't do this if you have that tiny budget, right? We can consider that if your budget were bigger, but with this tiny budget you have, well, that is dead on arrival. So we'll discuss how budgetary issues factor into survey design. Then third question is, who is my population and how can I easily access them? Now, you might be thinking that's a very trivial question. Obviously, this is my population. Now, it's not as trivial as it appears, because sometimes the population you have in mind may need to be redefined, right? Because it's not just about who the population is. The more interesting question is, can you actually access that population you have in mind? So sometimes you might have a population in mind that is very well defined, but logistically, it is impossible to access them. And so you might now have to find a way of reframing that population. Now, there are 2 kinds of solutions, or there are 2 kinds of problems that you can solve with the population. There are those problems that can be solved with grammar. And this is just saying you can use English language, and reward things. And that solves the problem automatically. We're going to see some examples of how you can use grammar to solve the problems of a population in terms of defining the population. But then there are other problems that can be solved with grammar. You can't talk your way out of every problem, right? Some problems need actual solutions. And so those are issues where you now need to deploy methodology to address them. So in terms of defining your population, how do we frame the population with grammar and English and language so that it fits what we can actually do? And when we are done with that, how can we then deploy methodology to address the rest of the problem? So let's look at an example. This is the National Adult Tobacco Survey. When you read surveys, I would like you to pay attention to some of the language used in describing the population and understand that it's not just, they're not just trying to be verbose or just say a lot of things. It is very carefully crafted to acknowledge the limitation. So look at this survey, for example. This says this was a survey of the non-institutionalized adults aged 18 years and older, residing in the 50 states or DC. Now, that short line tells you a lot, right? Non-institutionalized, what does that mean? Well, at the very beginning, perhaps the CDC wanted to do a survey of all US adults. Maybe that's how, somebody sitting in the office, the director of science was like, well, let's do a survey of all US adults. Then it's like, okay, but can we actually do a survey of all US adults? What about people who are in prison? How do we reach them? Okay, how about people who are military folks who are deployed overseas? How do we reach them? How about people who do not have a home? Then it's like, oh, okay, we cannot do a survey of all US adults. Let's use grammar to correct that problem. How about we say our survey is a survey of just the non-institutionalized US adults? Now, what does that mean? Well, it takes out people who are in prison automatically. They're no longer part of our population. We're not considering them because we can't access them. So we've removed them with grammar. We've used grammar to solve that problem. We've also removed people who are in the military. We've removed people who are not, who are in the streets, because if the survey is a household survey, we say, okay, we're only restricting people who live in houses, not those living in the streets. So we've solved that problem with grammar. And then there are also people who live in US territories, people who live in, and so we cannot access them for logistical reasons because our budget is small. And so we've specifically stated in the 50 US states or DC, meaning that you should be aware that we're not including people who live in the US territories, not in, the 50 US states and DC. So that's how you can use just language to reframe your population. So the issue of defining your population is not a trivial issue. It's a very important issue that you want to pay close attention to. Now, sometimes you also want to do a survey that there are other logistical issues at play that prevent you from just accessing the population you want. So this is a survey we did. I was the principal investigator with NIH and CDC. The goal was to do a survey of US dental practitioners. So all dental practitioners in the US and Canada. Well, logistically, what problems do we have just from saying, oh, we want to survey all people who do dental practice? Well, the problem is how are you going to access them? Is there a list of all people who are practicing that you can access easily? Well, maybe the American Dental Association has such a list, but they're not the only practitioners. Practitioners also include dental hygienists and includes a whole lot of other professionals. So how are you going to access them? Well, another suggestion might be then that we could reach out to the individual associations and ask them to partner. Well, that introduces a lot of logistical nightmares, working with different organizations. Now, if you had unlimited time and resources, of course, you could do that. Now, if we don't, what could we then do? Well, in this case, we said, all right, let's redefine our population entirely. Let us just say we are doing a survey of personnel in dental and allied schools. So dental schools, dental hygiene schools, dental assistant schools, and any other dental program. Now, notice that this significantly shifts the original population from what we had in mind. What we had in mind originally was people who are practicing dentistry. Now we're saying people who are practicing dentistry in a training program in an academic environment. So that significantly shifts the focus from what we had. But this is the reality of survey design. In life, you don't always get what you want, right? And this is also true in survey design. it's now your job to say, okay, what I want is nice, but I just seem to have a lot of difficulty accessing that. What is the closest thing to read that I can use, right? So this is where the art of survey design becomes really, really important, in defining the population and saying, okay, that population is just giving me just too much headache. How then can I redesign or re-engineer that population or the definition in a way that gets as close to what I want as possible? So in this case, this is what we ended up doing. We define our study population as faculty and staff in CODA accredited dental education programs in the US and Canada. And we reached out to them. And this was easy because, well, every educational institution has a directory of faculty on their website. Now, that's a way easier problem to solve. We can simply just use technology to extract all that information from the website easily. So it's logistically, it's an easier problem to solve. And you can also see that reflected in how or what we decided to exclude. So here we said we're excluding postdoctoral programs in DoD or VA institutions. DoD is the Department of Defense. VA is Veteran Affairs. Why? Because those are military institutions that do not publicize the names of their faculty. They don't put it on their website. So we can't access those. Well, logistically, what do we do then? We say, well, you are out of study by exclusion. The same thing with other programs that we can access. So the bottom line of what we're trying to say is that the definition of your study population is not a trivial thing. It is the most important aspect of your study because that has implications for the rest of the study in terms of who the inferences are directed to. So it's something you want to pay close attention to. Unfortunately, there's no formula for it. You as the expert have to sit down and say, what do I want versus what can I get? And by some series of negotiations or trade-offs, you can then finally define the population of interest for your study. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the PICO framework for interventional studies. There's another PICO framework which I developed for the sake of surveys, and they are similar in all but two respects. So the traditional PICO we use for interventional studies, we have P for population, I for intervention, C for comparison, and O for outcome. For surveys, we've switched out the I and the C to include I for independent strata and C for clusters, right? So in other words, when you're designing a survey, these are the four major ingredients you need to worry about: the population, the independent strata, the clusters, and the outcomes. I'm going to talk about each of those and see how we apply them in survey design. The goal is not from it's not from an academic perspective. So the goal is not to talk about the theoretical underpinnings, but to talk about it from a pure practical perspective so that you know what to do when designing your own survey. So we'll start with the P. We've already talked about P, but the idea is that we need to be familiar with what we call the cycle of inference. Cycle of inference is essentially the cycle through which inferences flow. The population gives birth to the sample through the process of sampling, and the sample gives us an estimate, which we then apply back to the population. This is what we call the cycle of inference. Now, the basis for the cycle of inference is randomness. In other words, the cycle of inference holds true because this process occurs at random, because the sampling part here is occurring at random. If this process was not at random, then this arrow here from sample to population cannot hold true. It then means that this arrow, instead of leading from the sample to the population, will lead from a sample back to the sample itself, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no rule saying that a survey that is not representative is useless. No. It can still be extremely useful. It's just that you need to be aware that if there's no random selection, this arrow cannot and will not lead from the sample to the population. Instead, this arrow will curve back and go back to the sample. In other words, inferences from the sample are only directed back to the sample. So we need to understand this basis, because this is the basis for how we sample and why we sample, because we want to take a sample that is small and make inferences that lead back to the population. And again, remember, when the desirable is not available, the available must be desirable. That is a foundational principle we'll keep repeating over and over, because survey design is not about being fancy. It's about being practical and using the little you have to generate evidence that can solve problems. So the goal is not to be fancy. No. We just want to solve problems. And so solving problems means that we must be flexible. Where desirable is not available, the available must be desirable. And that's the framework we're going to emphasize over and over. Now, let's talk about the I in PICO, which is independent strata. Stratification is a luxury in survey design. It's not something you must do, but it's something that you could consider doing to increase diversity. Now, there's a lot of talk about DEI has become the new buzzword. Well, stratification is the actual original DEI of statistics, right? The reason why we use stratification is for diversity, right? So stratification has no impact on validity. The reason why we stratify is not necessarily to improve validity. No. The reason we stratify is to increase the diversity of the samples, to make sure that there's equity, to make sure there's inclusion in the survey. So before all this buzz about DI, before DI became a bad word, it was already in full use as statistical principles in survey design. So that is the reason why we stratify. So again, it's very important to note that the goal is not to improve validity. It has no impact on validity, but it surely improves the inclusion and the diversity of our samples. So this is a pictorial representation of stratification. If we did not stratify, it's as if we had one large population. If we stratified, it means that we separate the population into the respective strata, and then we proceed to sample from each stratum. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we're doing when we stratify. Now, the question is, why should we do that, or why do we do that? The reasoning behind stratification is that if we were to leave selection in the survey just to equal chance, there's a very high probability that these guys in red might not get selected, or might not get selected in sufficient numbers to make any meaningful inference to them. Because probability is a game of numbers. And here, the guys in green are the vast majority. So if we were just leave it to probability alone and say everybody has an equal selection or probability of selection, well, these guys in red will be very, very, very few. So what do? We then separate the population into the respective parts, the red and the blue, and treat each one separately. So we'll say, all right, you, Mr. Red, we're going to give you a fair chance. So we're going to treat you specially and select from you specially to guarantee. So that's what it does. It guarantees that people who are in the red sector here will be selected in sufficient numbers. Now, when we're selecting, we don't just apply the same sampling fraction. We don't say, oh, we want to select, let's say the sampling fraction is 5%. Let's say we want to select 5% of the overall population here. If we were to apply to the whole population, that's simple. We just select 5% of this overall population, and that gives us our sample. If we stratified and we applied the same fraction to the red and to the green, it means we'll select 5% of those in red and 5% of those in green, right? That is called proportionate stratified sampling. In other words, we stratify and then we apply this exact same proportion to each stratum. But remember that these guys here are very small. So 5% of this blue is a large number, but 5% of the guys in red is a small number. Why? Because they're small. So what do? We can say, well, since you guys are so small, how about we give you 20%? We'll take 20% of you guys in red because you're very small. So at least if you give you 20%, that allows you to have sufficient numbers for the survey. And then for you, well, you can still stay as 5%. Now, that is what we call a disproportionate stratified sampling. Why disproportionate? Well, because 20 and 5 are not the same thing, right? We are applying different sampling fractions so that enough of these guys in red can be represented in the survey. That's why we do stratified sampling, to ensure that we have enough diversity and enough inclusion from the different individuals. So Like we said, it allows for representation from groups that otherwise would be too small to be captured in the survey. Now, once you stratify in the population, you must select from that stratum. Imagine we stratified these groups and then we said, oh, well, having stratified, we will just exclude all of the guys in red. We will not select anybody in this red sector. Well, what you have just done is what we call, you have introduced non-coverage bias. Non-coverage bias is when an entire swath of the population is not included or is systematically excluded. So if you stratify, it's obvious that you must then sample from that stratum. Otherwise, you are introducing non-coverage bias and your result won't be generalizable. So once you stratify, every single stratum must be sampled. Now, the C in PICO represents clusters. So what are clusters? Well, clusters are, as the name implies, groups of people who live in a same area. Think of the clusters of grapes. Those are grapes that are on the same vine or, you know, or thereabout. Now, why do we need clusters? Well, we need clusters because it is the closest thing we have. A foundational principle of surveys is that we must have a list, right? So if there's nothing you take out of this class, it should be the idea that for surveys to be random, there must be a list. Now, that list ideally will be a list of all the people who live in that population. If we're to do a survey, for example, of the US, we're going to say all the, hundreds of millions of people, we need all their names. Well, obviously that's very impractical. You're rarely going to get a list of all the names of people who live in the place. So now that's our first option that is already dead on arrival. We don't have it. So a list of all the people, we don't have that. Now remember, when the desirable is not available, the available must be desirable. So the question is, if we don't have a list of people, what other list can we get? Well, how about a list of all the places where people can be found? Like ideally, we'd have loved to have a list of all the people themselves, but we don't have that. There's no way we can get it. So, well, the second best thing is a list of all the places where people are found, because the end goal is to get the people. So if we can list all the places where they're found, well, then we can get those people in those places. That's the idea. So we now start drafting the list. So the question then is, where can people be found? Well, people can be found in schools. They can be found in neighborhoods. They can be found in the streets. They can be found in workplaces. So if we provided a complete list of all the schools, if our study population is students, or all the neighborhoods, and we selected them at random, well, that gets us the original goal of getting to the people in those neighborhoods. So that's the whole idea behind cluster sampling. The idea is that if the desirable is not available, the available must be desirable. What we desired originally was a list of all the people in the community. We can't get that list. So we go to the second best thing we have, which is the list of all the places where people can be found. Now, the only thing we ask is that the cluster should be as close to the ground as possible. It should contain the least amount of individuals as possible. Remember, our goal was to get a list where each individual name was on its own. So the second best thing would be to create a list of groups where each group contains as few people as possible. That would be the ideal. Now, what's the minimum number of clusters that you can have in a survey for it to be precise? Well, the answer is 8. Since we always like clean answers, I want to give you a clean answer you don't have to worry about. I'm not giving you philosophies or principles. It's just 8. So where do we get this 8 from? Well, we get it from NCHS guidance or rules for precision of estimates in surveys. According to NCHS guidelines, if the degrees of freedom of a survey is less than 8, then that survey is considered to be imprecise. Degrees of freedom is simply equal to the number of clusters minus the number of strata. And that's how you get your degrees of freedom in the survey. But the moral of the story is don't have less than 8 clusters in your survey. Otherwise, it's not precise enough to meet the standards or quality standards for a decent survey. So have 8 clusters or more. Remember that stratification is a luxury. You don't have to stratify your survey, but if you're going to use clusters, you must have 8 of them or more. Now, when you are using clusters, you should be aware of the limitations of using cluster sampling. The idea is the apple does not fall far from a tree. What does that mean? Well, people in the same cluster tend to look alike. If we're using, for example, schools as clusters, you need to be aware that, well, they go to the same school, most likely they live in the same neighborhood, maybe they have similar traits, they have similar exposures. And that's important because the degree of diversity you wanted might be reduced when you use clusters because they are clones of each other. Let's imagine an extreme case scenario where every second person in a cluster is a clone of the first person. It means, therefore, that every second answer we get is an exact replica of the initial of the first one. So if our survey wanted to get 100 unique responses, well, what we have is not 100 unique responses. We only have 50. Why? Because every second guy is a clone of the first one. So when we use cluster sampling, we need to be aware of this phenomenon and we need to correct for it. And we correct for this when we're doing sample size calculation with what we call the design effect. The design effect is a number that punishes the clusters for being so related to each other. So it allows us to inflate our sample size a little more to account for the fact that, you know, people are clones of each other. Well, putting it very loosely, obviously. So when we're calculating our sample size, we need to account for that. A design effect of 1 is what we'll expect in a simple random survey. The simple random survey has a design effect of 1. However, with cluster sampling, we'll expect a design effect higher than 1, for example, 1.5 or 2, as the case might be, or 3. So we need to be aware of this when we're calculating sample size for surveys. Again, we're going to show all of this in the demo, so we'll see, so that all the different parts come together. So it's not just very abstract, but it's something we need to be aware of. So this is just to put everything we've said so far, that sometimes the decision is made for you already. So if you're asking yourself, oh, what sampling technique should I use? Like, maybe that question is completely irrelevant because that decision has already been made for you by your circumstances. Because the question you need to ask is, does a complete, correct, and current sampling frame exist? Can I create one? In other words, do you have a list of everybody in that community? Well, if the answer is no, you have no choice. The only thing available to you is to use cluster sampling. So the point here is you should be able to reflect and take account of the current situation and know what your options are. If you can create a sampling frame, great, good for you. You can maybe use simple random sampling or use systematic sampling. If you don't have a sampling frame or you cannot create a list of everybody, well, the only option that you have is to use cluster sampling. So again, making a distinction between clusters and strata. Remember we said strata is a luxury item. You can afford not to use stratification. Well, you can't afford not to use cluster sampling in many, many, many situations in the real world. In 95% of real world surveys, well, you have no choice but use cluster sampling. You must use, you don't have a choice. So cluster sampling is the very opposite of stratification in terms of choice. This one leaves you no choice. You have no choice but use it. Stratification, you always have a choice whether you want to use stratification or not. So that's, we want to make sure we emphasize that so that we're all on the same page on that. This is just a mnemonic for you to remember that strata starts with S. That's helps you remember that everybody in the same strata looks the same. Cluster starts with C. That's just a way to remind you that there's contrast within the cluster. People look different. This is putting that same thing in a picture. When we stratify, what we do is we separate the people into different buckets so that within each bucket, they all look the same. Remember, strata starts with S, which means everybody is the same. So everybody in the same stratum looks exactly the same. So that's why when we stratify, we must select from each stratum. Otherwise, we have introduced non-coverage bias. However, with clusters, it's the exact same different thing. Everybody in a cluster looks different. But the idea is that one cluster looks like the other cluster, which looks like the other cluster. So the idea is if all the clusters are the same, we don't have to sample all the clusters. We don't have to select all of them. We can just take a sample of the clusters and we should be fine. So that's the theoretical basis for selecting a few clusters out of many. So if you go to a school or if you go to a state and you want to sample from schools, well, you don't have to select all the schools. Why? Because at least the theory is that one cluster looks like the other, looks like the other. So if we took a random sample of clusters, we should be fine. So in principle, that is quite different from how we manage strata. So this is a worked example to try and tie what we've covered so far. You plan to do a survey of adults in Western Nigeria. There are 6 states in the region, and you want to select 2 states as clusters. Let's say Lagos State and Oyo State. You want to select those as your clusters. Now, that is a really bad design. Why? Because number one, you have decided to choose Lagos and Oyo. That's not a random choice. Number two, you only have 2 clusters that you're selecting out of the 6. That is bad practice. Remember, we said the minimum number of clusters you can have is 8. Number 3, you're using entire states as clusters, which completely undermines what we said earlier, that the clusters must be as close to the ground as possible, right? So what can you then do? What would be a better approach? Well, instead of selecting Lagos and Oyo as clusters, you can redefine your study population as those 2 states. My study population was adults living in Lagos and Oyo State. And then you can select clusters within those 2. So for example, you can choose 10 local government areas out of the 53 and then select individuals from them. Now, that would be a more sensible study design as opposed to what you had in mind. That previous one was dead on arrival from a scientific perspective because it violated every single rule in survey design. So this is how you could think about it. Now, let's talk about the O in PICO, which is the outcome. The outcome means that we want to pay attention to issues of measurement bias. Where we can, we want to include objective indicators. So people can upload images. If I'm interested in looking at a survey on the types of cigarettes people smoke, whether it's menthol or non-menthol, well, instead of just asking them, what kind of cigarettes do you smoke? I can say, please, can you upload a picture of your cigarette pack, of your last cigarette pack? You see, that is a more objective way of collecting the same data. Response options mutually exclusive, yet completely, collectively exhaustive. So don't provide answers that overlap and make sure that all possible answers are included. Don't include questions that are that are leading. Leading questions are questions that you are trying to lead the participants to the answer you have in mind. So for example, a question that says, how harmful do you think e-cigarettes are? That's a very leading question. Now, if I did not know that e-cigarettes were harmful, the way you have framed the question is designed to make me believe that it is harmful. At baseline, is the question of its harmfulness is not even in doubt. It's now just for us to rate how harmful it is. That's a very leading question, right? A better way to say it would be, how harmful or not do you believe e-cigarettes are? So that it's balanced and neutral. So don't lead the participants to the answer that you have in mind. You also have to remember that people do not listen to instructions. When you're designing a survey, don't tell people, please answer this question only if you are eligible or only if you meet this criteria. People don't read. They are just going to answer that question right away, And then at the end of the day, you'll start having to worry about data cleaning. So the rule of thumb is, if you are cleaning your data, it means you collected the data wrong. That is as simple as that. If you have to clean the data post facto, it means that you did not do due diligence enough at the beginning when you were designing the survey and collecting your information. This is the work you are doing now, is the work you should have done then. Remember, we say prevention is better than cure. So no, you don't want to wait till the end, collect bad data, and then say, oh, how are we going to clean the data? That is not good. So you correct that by making sure that you use survey logic. Survey logic includes a whole lot of logic. Simply means rules. So you set up rules, automated rules that the survey platform will enforce, like skip patterns and inclusion criteria. Again, we're going to do all of this practically in a few minutes. So we'll see how all of the things come together. And then we want to, of course, consider ethical issues and make sure that your survey has been cleared by an ethical board. Make sure that you include consent forms and that the consent form includes the minimum elements required, like purpose of the study, how the data will be used, whether there are incentives, as well as potential benefits and harms. Every study has harms. Don't say your study doesn't have a harm. No matter how small the risk of the harm, there's still the risk that, well, there are questions that might trigger somebody, or there are questions, there's always also the risk of loss of, identity, of privacy from participants. So those are risks. No matter how small the risks are, they are still there and must be quantified and presented to participants. And then when you are administering incentives, you also want to make sure that you worry about data quality. When you administer incentives, the problem is that you have a lot of bad faith actors who come to your survey and now say, oh, wow, there's money in this survey. Hey, everybody, come and take the survey, right? You now end up capturing a lot of noise, which is what you don't want. So what are some of the safeguards that you want to keep in mind when you have incentives in the survey? We're going to discuss some of those things. And then after your data collection, you need to assess data quality. That includes things like duplicates, missingness, skipped answers, ineligible answers, non-responses, partial completes, and others. You want to consider speeders and representativeness. Remember that we said one of the key criteria for a good surveillance system is the representativeness. So you want to consider how representative the survey is. And question then is, how do you do that? We're going to do that in our hands-on session in a minute. One of the very important things you have to consider when you are managing a surveillance system is weighting. Should we weight the data or not? Very, very important decision that has huge implications for the surveillance and for the quality of data. So the question is always to weigh or not to weigh the data. Now, for those of us who are not familiar with the concept of weighting, weighting is a statistical procedure that deals with non-response. So you conduct your survey, you have done all your due diligence, but lo and behold, after your survey, you find that 20% of the population in the survey is female, as opposed to 50% in the real world. Obviously, your survey has major issues of non-response, or of either non-coverage or non-response bias. Now you have to deal with that because it means that your survey is not representative of the population of interest. So we have ways to deal with those things. These are not new problems. These are problems that we've encountered since the beginning of surveillance in time. And there are robust statistical procedures that can deal with those problems. And so one of the ways we use in most large national surveys is raking. Raking is a form of weighting that applies to different variables and forces the sample to become like the parent population. Again, it sounds complicated, but it's really not complicated in practice. I would demonstrate that in part of our hands-on session. But this is a highly simplified version of what weighting works, of how it works. Here is our sample. This is our sample that is obviously just very amorphous and does not look like the population in any way. This is our population, by the way, right? And this is our sample. So in other words, this is like saying, oh, our sample, 20% of this are female, but in the parent population, it's like more closer to 50. So this doesn't look like this in any way, shape, or form. The magic that weighting does is that it takes this clay and forces it to adopt the shape of the parent population, so that weighting transforms this clay to this shape. So suddenly, this guy and this guy are suddenly now more comparable. So now note that they're not perfectly the same. There's still some differences between this and this, but for the sake of comparability, we can safely say that this is much better comparable to this than this was. This is what we're trying to achieve with weight. So in statistical terms, what we're doing is that we are creating a pseudo population. A pseudo population simply means a fake population that does not exist. It's a mathematical model, right? So that's what weighting does. It takes the original data and creates a model, a mathematical model that simulates or looks like the main population so much, but it only looks like that population on the variables that we weighted. Very important to note. So what does that mean for you? It means that as you are conducting your survey, you should hope for the best, but plan for the worst. It means that make sure that your survey has all the weighting variables you might need. You don't know whether you're going to need it until the end. This is one of those things that you don't know until the end, very end, when you've done with the survey and you examine the data, you're like, oops, our survey is not representative. So make sure that you have identified for example, in the US, we use the census or we use other national sources of data to weight the data against. Make sure that the variables you are collecting, you wish to correct for, are there in your survey. If you do not ask for them in your survey, you cannot correct for them. Make sure that the variables are framed in the same way that you have it in the census. So if the census has information on gender as, let's say, male, female, male or female, then it means that the way you collect the data in your questionnaire must also be the same way as was captured in the census, right? So for you to weight data, you must have a calibration source. You must have this, for example, the census, because at the end of the day, we're going to use data from the census to force our sample to look like a census. That's what we're doing, essentially. So you must make sure that you have the variables captured in your survey. They must be exact same way as they were captured in the census, right? And that is what we are ultimately going to use at the end of the survey to generate our weighting algorithm. So we'll now do a quick hands-on session that tries to bring all of the elements. Like we said earlier, this session is by no means designed to make you experts in survey design, but to give you a very, very high-level picture of what the nuances are in survey design. And then later on, in collaboration with UCSF, we're going to release, more targeted courses that take each element and goes, takes a deep dive into each element. For today, it was just designed to give us that very high-level picture of the nuances that we have to consider when we're designing surveillance systems. So for our hands-on practice, we're going to do a mock design of a national survey. We will look at sample size calculation. We'll look at sampling. We'll look at a questionnaire design. We have just 2 or 3 questions we're going to add in our survey. And we're going to see how do we assess for data quality and weighting, right? How do we create weights? And so you see that it's not really that complicated. It sounds complicated, but it's really not, as far as you understand the principles of what is involved. All right, so I'm going to switch over now and go over to our hands-on session where we'll do a quick survey. So here we're trying to do a national survey of persons aged 12 years or older. I have 4 or 5 questions here, which we're going to do. But first of all, we're going to go through all those elements: sample size calculation, sampling, questionnaire design, assessment of data quality, and weight. And we'll do that in maybe 20 or 25 minutes so that it covers everything. This is going to be rapid fire, so it's not going to be an elaborate discussion of each element, but it's just so that we can put all the pieces together and see how everything ties together. So that's the goal. And then with subsequent sessions, we're going to do a deeper dive and explain each of those elements comprehensively. So let's go into our hands-on session. So we're going to use the Chisquares platform for all of those elements for the sample size calculation. We're also going to provide access to you to access the platform for free and to also practice. This is something you have to practice. Practice makes good. So your homework might be to try your hand at seeing some of those things we've discussed so that you can then see how you could improve your skills in those things. So on the left-hand side of a panel, you'll see the various elements that address different aspects of study design, from surveys to sampling to sample size, and so on and so forth. The very first item on our list was sample size considerations. What are some of the practical considerations we need to keep in mind when designing surveys, large national surveys? So let's go there now. So sample size, and let's start new sample size. And we're going to select cross-sectional studies. We have 2 options here, with percentage as outcome or with mean as outcome. If you're not sure, in most large national surveys, we don't have only one outcome. Obviously, we have many, many outcomes, hundreds of outcomes. If you're not sure of what outcome to use, always use percentage as outcome, because that is guaranteed to give you a larger sample size. It's one of those areas that you want to err on the side of caution. It's better to get as much sample size as the maximum sample size that you need, which you hope will cover every scenario, than to go for a small sample size and then find yourself lacking for some indicators. So we'll go to here and select cross-sectional study with percentage as outcome. Now, there are certain fields we need to populate here. The platform provides you with hints so that you can understand what each parameter means, so that you know it's kind of educational. So you can read what each parameter means if you're not familiar with it. Now, there are certain things we need to provide here. First is the level of confidence desired. The default value provided is 95. Now, there's some parameters you don't really need to change, like these ones. These are standard measures that you can just leave as they are. The prevalence of outcome. You obviously don't know the prevalence, because that's the whole reason why you're doing the survey. If you knew the prevalence, you would not do the survey. So if you don't know the prevalence, just put 50. Now, what is special about 50? Well, 50 is the number in the middle. At 50%, we are guaranteed of maximum variance. When we say, for example, that a country is very polarized, it means 50% of the population agree on something, the other 50% disagree. That's when you have maximum variance. Maximum variance guarantees maximum sample size. And that's why we use 50. So again, to err on the side of caution, because you don't know what the actual sample size might be, just go for the parameter that will give you the maximum sample size, so that regardless of whatever happens, you will be covered. So prevalence of outcome, we put in 50 there. Population size, the default is 1 million. Now, the reality of sample size calculation is that sample size is agnostic of population size. Remember that sample size calculation is like taking a sip from a coffee pot, or if you're cooking a soup, you want to taste a little out of it. The amount of soup you taste is independent of the size of a pot. So it doesn't matter whether the soup you're cooking is in a massive pot or in a tiny pot, the amount you're going to just taste is the same. The same thing applies with population size. It doesn't matter whether you put the population size of 1 million or 1 billion. It doesn't affect sample size. The only time the population size affects the sample size is when you have very, very small population size. But if your population size is like, significantly large, like 100,000 or hundreds of thousands or more, you don't have to tamper with the population size. You can just leave it the way it is. It's fine. Now, when we now start doing or paying considerations to large surveys, is when we now come to this question here. Will cluster sampling be performed? Well, if you're doing a large national survey, well, most likely, yes. You're likely going to use cluster sampling. Remember, we use cluster sampling when we do not have a complete list of all the participants or all the population members. In that case, we have no choice but use cluster sampling. Remember, we said sometimes those decisions are already made for you. You have no choice. So in this case, we might go ahead and say, yes, we're using cluster sampling. When we select this, this opens up some additional fields which we need to provide information on. The first is the design effect. Remember, we said earlier that the apple does not fall far from a tree. And that means that when we use cluster sampling, individuals who are in the same cluster tend to look alike. And what that means is that for us, in our sample, we don't have as much variance or as much variability as we will need to or as we would like to. And so we need to punish those clusters for being so similar. And that's where the design effect comes in. The design effect punishes the clusters for being so correlated. Now, remember, we also said that the design effect of 1 is the same thing as a simple random sample. So if we're using a cluster sample, obviously our design effect cannot be 1. It has to be more than 1. Now, what do we use? Well, the suggestions are provided for you here. You can use a value between 1.5 and 4. And so let's say we want to use 1.5 as our design effect. Next, we have to provide number of strata. Again, remember we said that in a survey, stratification is a luxury. It's not something we must do. It's something we can choose to do as a DEI measure. Well, I'm using the word DEI in quotes. So we want to increase the diversity of our sample, how to make sure that people are included. People who otherwise not be included in sufficient numbers, we want to make sure that they're captured in our survey. That's why we do stratification. It's a luxury, not a requirement. So if we don't want to stratify, well, it means that we have one large population only and no strata. If we want to stratify, we can increase the number of strata. But we want to be very aware that stratification is not a joke. It's not cheap. It doesn't come cheap. Stratification increases our sample size exponentially. If we wanted to have 2 strata, our sample size would just double the sample size. So if we wanted to stratify, for example, by gender, let's say 2 categories, male and female, and let's say by let's say age, where we have young, middle, and old, middle age and older. So 2 categories for gender and 3 categories for age. Well, that means we're going to have 2 times 3, which is 6 strata. So the more variables you include, the more strata you're going to have. That becomes extremely, extremely expensive. Because imagine that you are paying incentives to participants. If you had $10 as incentives for participants, and suddenly you've increased the sample size by a factor of 6, well, you better increase your budget by a factor of 6 too. Otherwise, you won't be covered. And this is why we were saying earlier that there are some things you don't just even think about if you don't have money. Like if you are broke and you're doing a survey on a budget, stratification, you have no business thinking about stratification. You should just worry about how do I just use clustering with one single cluster, right? Those are actual, just common sense decisions that are made for you when you are facing certain constraints, like financial constraints. Stratification is for the rich, not for the poor. So let's remember that, because once you stratify, it significantly increases the logistical and financial costs for the study. So in this case, we don't have money, so we're going to just keep it at 1 stratum. And the margin of error. The margin of error is also trade-offs. Margin of error tells us how wide the confidence interval should be. So the width of the confidence interval is the margin of error times 2. So that means that if we have a margin of error of 5, that tells us that our confidence interval is going to be 10 percentage points wide. And we're happy to live with that. You can't be broke and be picky at the same time. So you can't say, oh, I want very narrow confidence intervals, but I don't have money. that such a thing does not exist, right? The moment you don't have money, it means you are willing to live with a lot of trade-offs. For example, it means that you are willing to accept that your confidence intervals might be very wide, because you suddenly have to accept a wider margin of error. So because if we calculate the sample size for a margin of error of 5, and let's say we get a result of 1,921, if we said, well, we want less error, we're going to reduce the margin of error from 5 to, let's say, 3. Obviously, we want narrower confidence intervals, but that comes at a cost. It means that we're going to increase our sample size. So let's say we reduce it to 3, and we calculate it again. The sample size has increased from 1,900 and something to 5,336, right? So those kinds of decisions about margin of error and stratification, again, are not for the poor. Those are for the rich. So if you have a large budget, then you have a luxury to say, oh, let's make the confidence intervals narrower. Let's increase the number of strata. If you're working on a budget, you have no business discussing those kind of things, right? Because they are inconsistent with the budget you have. So that's why we said earlier that one of the very key things you have to pay attention to when designing surveys is, number 2 was the budget. How much money do you have? Because just telling me your budget, that tells me all the things that you cannot and can do, right? It's a rate limiting step for the design of the survey. And so the up here, you can get the formula that was used in the sample size calculation here. And then you can, make changes as needed, right? The whole point of sample size calculation is that it is not a number fixed in stone. So you should be able to say, okay, how will the sample size change? Should we alter let's let's say, the margin of error, or the number of strata, or the response rate. Those are things that you can play with and see. But those are the considerations we have to pay attention to when we calculate sample size. So the bottom line here, the most important thing here is that with large surveys, we need to account for the design effect, right? We can't forget this item here. The design effect is extremely important when we use cluster sampling, and especially when we have no choice but use cluster sampling, then we must consider the design effect because it has huge implications. Setting the design effect at 1 is not it's not consistent with statistical reality because you're using a cluster sample but pretending you're not using one. So we want to be realists and make sure that the way we're calculating sample size is consistent with the actual design. All right, so having calculated sample size, the next step is to sample. But sample size tells us we need 5,000 people, 5,300 people in the US. But that doesn't tell us where we have to sample those individuals. That's the next part of the question that we have to address. So under the sampling field, that allows us to select sampling. There are 2 options here for you. You can automatically draw representative samples. So what the platform has done is that it has collected data from each country's census and the sampling units, which are the second administrative units. So for example, in the US, we have states as the first administrative unit, and then we have counties. So the counties are treated as clusters, right? For all countries, so the second administrative unit is treated as clusters. So you can use automatic sampling, or you can upload your own sampling frame, whichever you want. So let's say we want to sample with the data already on the platform, which comes from the census. So we'll select the United States as our population. The next option is for us to indicate which state we want to sample. But if we want to do a national survey, we don't have to select any particular state. So in this case, we're going to leave this field blank. Next is how many clusters do we want to sample? Remember that the minimum number of clusters you should have in the survey is 8, right? Anything above that is now an issue of luxury. Obviously, the more the number of clusters we have, the more precise our estimates will be. But I must emphasize that number of clusters has nothing to do with validity. It has everything to do with precision. In other words, another way of saying that is that we can still get accurate results if we have 8 versus 80 versus 8,000 or clusters, right? The accuracy is not affected by the number of clusters. What is affected is how wide or how narrow our confidence intervals will be. So the number of clusters does not affect validity, but it will affect precision. So here, how many clusters can we afford to access? Well, let's say I want to go to 30 clusters. That is way above 8, so I'm covered. And then the sample size that we calculated earlier was 5,330. So I provide that there, and I get the sample. So what the platform is doing behind the scenes is that it is implementing a sampling technique called a 2-stage PPS. There's a link here to a WHO paper for those of us who are methodologists. I want to read more about the methodology. But the beauty of a 2-stage PPS is just its simplicity and its elegance. It's simple because a 2-stage PPS guarantees you a self-weighting sample, meaning that you don't have to worry about weights and all of that. It guarantees that the sample will be self-weighting. And so you see that everybody has the exact same probability of selection. So it's so simple, so elegant to use, and that's why it's used on the platform. So here we can see a visualization of the areas that have been selected. So remember we said we wanted to sample 5,330 adults from the US. The sampling is done with probability proportional to size. And so this are the areas that have been selected. So this is telling me to go to this place and sample 178 of the 2,046 residents that live there, and so on and so forth. So this guarantees me that my sample will be nationally representative. I can also access the same data from the table and see which counties have been selected, the states they are in, and then it's now my job to now figure out how I'm going to go to that area and select those individuals accordingly. But at least I know where I have to go to select them. So now I have both of those problems solved for me, which is how many people do I need to include in my survey, and where do I find them? That has been resolved for me. The next part of the question which we needed to address was the issue of how do we create questionnaires and make sure that we include logic in them, so that we don't tell people, oh, don't answer this question. No, we provide automation that enforces that logic. So the next part of what we're going to demonstrate is that part. How do you create questionnaires? We're going to use our short questionnaire of 3 or 4 questions and just demonstrate that. And then we also, as we're doing that, we'll be looking at issues of weighting. When we are creating our questionnaires, what should be at the top of our mind when we're creating those questionnaires, knowing that the principle is hope for the best, but plan for the worst. We are planning for the worst, knowing that our data will be very, very poor in terms of response, non-response, right? We know that the data may not be generalizable. We don't want the case of medicine after death. So it's not when we collect the data, then we're not like, oops, the data are not representative. But oops, we did not collect data on age or sex or all the variables we need to weight the data on. No. That shows we're not proactive in our design of our survey. We need to plan for these things before we collect the data, so that we can correct for them afterwards. That is how a good methodologist will work. So let's go to survey design and let's see how we can create questions and make sure that we consider issues of automation and logic, and also practical considerations that we need to weigh in when we're creating weights at the end of the day. So to start a survey, we simply come to survey design here and click on this button that says Start New Survey. This is just telling you that you can conduct both cross-sectional and longitudinal surveys on the platform. So it's not just single-time surveys, but you can also collect longitudinal surveys that follow people over time. And so we'll click on Let's Get Started. So here you provide the basic information about the survey. So here I'm going to say, for example, National Adult Tobacco Survey. That's the title of my survey. The participants are located in the United States. The primary aims, every study has aims. So it's good practice to generate aims. If you don't want to type your aims manually, you can just generate them with AI by clicking this button here, generate with AI. It takes the context for the study and it will suggest aims for you accordingly in keeping with the overall title of the project. So here, for example, it has generated aims for us to investigate the prevalence of tobacco use among US adults, to assess the association between stress levels and tobacco use, and so on and so forth. We can just go ahead and select some specific ones we want. I like this one, to explore the factors influencing smoking initiation. And let me pick one last one. To characterize the patterns of tobacco use, and we can clear the remaining ones. And of course, we can edit any of these ones should we desire. The keywords, again, I can generate keywords with AI, or I can type them manually. So the keywords here that have been generated by AI include quitting behaviors and tobacco patterns and smoking initiation. I can clear the remaining ones away. So there are, of course, ethical issues. The platform is linked with an independent ethical review board should our study meet any of this criteria. So for example, if we said our study involves pregnant women or children, it flags that the study might need ethical review. So let's create a new project. So this is a collaborative platform, which means that many people can work together. The whole idea is to address issues of collaboration where you have to send documents via people. If you're conducting a national survey, you should realize that you're going to have hundreds of partners. There are going to be dozens, at the very least, dozens of people. Obviously, you don't want a scenario where you have to now start sending documents via email, because you are going to have to deal with version control problems, and that is not what you want. The easier approach will be to have all the partners added as collaborators on the platform so that people can make changes and edits in real time. That is a much cleaner way to work than having to pull out your hair because of having to deal with collaborator issues. So to add collaborators, you provide their emails and you assign them a role. That's, let's say, project owner or co-lead. There's no limit to the number of collaborators you can have. You can have as many as possible. And once you're done, you save, and that sends an invitation to them to invite them to your project. Initially, we had said our study involved pregnant women, and so that has triggered this warning here that your study may need IRB approval. If we want to set it up on the platform is linked with an independent ethical review board, and you can fill out the ethical form and submit from the platform. In this case, I'm just going to dismiss this because it's not relevant. So here, now we can add our questions. Now, at this point in your survey design, you want to make sure that you build logic, automation into the survey. This is where data cleaning begins. Data cleaning is not when you have collected the data and you now have to start worrying about, oh, how do I make sure data are clean? No. It starts here. This is when you start implementing data cleaning. So, for example, let's start and add a few questions. Let's say we're adding a question on country, and the survey is only to be participated by US adults age 18 years or older. So let's see how we can ensure that only those individuals are part of the study. So let's add a question, a drop-down menu question for country. In what country do you live? Each question you create must have a label. The label is what later on becomes the variable name. So the idea is that we don't have to collect data and then afterwards start assigning variable names. That can be done seamlessly in real time. So we can type the variable name, or if you don't know or you're not sure, you can get suggestions from AI. So we click here. These are some of the suggestions that AI has provided. You can look at some more. You can hide, or you can type, whichever you want yourselves. Country, for example, which was one of the suggestions by AI. Now, obviously, I don't want to start typing countries manually. That will take forever. So I can explore system supplied settings here and simply select countries of the world right here and apply that to the survey. And once I'm done, I can push that to questionnaire. So I've added that question. Now let me add another question about, let's say, the age. So again, I'm going to add a drop-down menu question and say, how old are you? So the label will be age. And again, I can ask, get suggestions from AI. So for this, I can choose to provide lower and upper limit. That means provide a lower limit and an upper limit, and the system should automatically fill the values in between. So lower and upper limits apply. The lower limits is, let's say, ages 0 to ages 200, for example. And I can preview how this is going to look like. So how old are you? These are the answers here. When you are creating questions, make sure that each survey question meets 3 elements. It must have a question, it must have instructions, and it must have the response options. So this is an incomplete question because it only has the stem, it doesn't have instructions. How old are you? The instruction should say, please provide your answer in years by selecting one option below. So let's make it complete. Please provide your answer in years by selecting one option below. So again, every question must have those 3 elements. There must be the stem, which is the question itself, which is how old are you? There must be instructions, which is, in this case, this part here. And then there must be the answer options themselves. So how old are you? Please provide your answer in years by selecting one option below. And then these are the response options. Because if we do not provide these instructions, the user is left wondering, this 0, are they months or are they days, or what exactly are they, right? Providing instructions helps clarify that perfectly for the user. So we can push them to questionnaires. Now, let's just add one more question to, let's say, number of cigarettes smoked in the past 30 days. And then we can add logic and explain some of the elements that we're doing. So let's add one more question. Let's add an open-ended question this time around that says, in the past 30 days, how many cigarettes did you smoke? So I'm going to call this 6 smoked as my variable name. Now, again, like we said, when you are creating questions is when you want to enforce, rules. If we do not put any enforcement of rules, it's possible that some people could type things like 5, or they could type things like, some people could answer 5, or people could type gibberish and now I have the unenviable task of having to now clean this data. Why? Because I did not set any enforcement or any rules to guide the kind of data that will be collected. This is bad practice. What I should do is make sure that I set validation rules that ensure that any response other than the type I want is not allowed. So in this case, I only want numbers only. Also, this question is unclear because people could have smoked in sticks. They could have smoked 5. That 5 is a very confusing number because is it 5 sticks, or is it 5 packs, or is it 5 cartons, right? So whenever you're collecting data on quantities, physical quantities, you want to make sure you provide units of measurement so that people provide the answers, but also provide the units of measurements. That is how you make sure the quality of data is clean. So here, I'm going to do a bit more to this question. I'll go to the settings here. And first of all, say I want to allow only numbers. And I want to provide units of measurements. The units of measurement could be sticks. They could be puffs, or let's say cartons, or let's say packs, or they could be, let's say, cartons. And the minimum is 0. I don't want negative numbers. It's not possible to smoke -5 cigarettes. That doesn't make any sense. So the minimum is 0. Then I'm going to leave the maximum open. So this is what I mean by saying data cleaning starts when you are setting the question. It's not a case of medicine after death. As you're creating your questionnaire, impose logical rules right there and then that would prevent you from cleaning the data afterwards. Because any act of data cleaning means that you failed in your responsibility to set up the questionnaire in a way that was clean. So these are some of the minimum things that you want to do. So now I have set up this. So if I look at this now, the preview, in the past 30 days, how many cigarettes did you smoke? The value will be implemented there, and they can select the units that they indeed require. And then I can push this questionnaire. Now, before we leave here, we want to make sure that, remember we said you want to make sure that you implement logic in a questionnaire. Don't tell people, please only answer this question if you are in the US or if you are age 18. Why are you telling them that? You can set those as logic. So let's set up logic here, for example. We'll come to logic here, and we'll come to inclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria is what determines who is allowed to participate in the survey. So inclusion criteria, right now we have no inclusion criteria set up yet. So let us set up our inclusion criteria with the variables country and age. We are done with selecting. So we're saying you are eligible if country is exactly equal to the United States. If I had many countries, I would say containing any of, and I will select the countries of interest, and age is greater or equal to 18 years old. So that is how I set my logic. It's that simple. And I can then submit this. This is telling me that once the logic is set, the questions will become required, and that's fine. The logic is set now. Now, these are text that will be displayed to people at the beginning, letting them know that the questionnaire has screeners. So I can save and include. this tells people who are not eligible that thank you for your interest, but you're not eligible. You can edit this, by the way. If I want that, I can save and include. And then for those who are eligible, it tells them, yes, you're eligible, and this is the text. Again, you can save, you can change that if you wanted. And this is how you set inclusion criteria. So this is just one of many, many logic you can set. But the point I'm trying to make is that for every scenario, for everything that you are cleaning your data for, it could have been prevented. There's an equivalent way you could have prevented that at the very beginning. So from, you want to think of data cleaning as really medicine after death. We have failed to do what we should have done a long time ago, and now we have to suffer for it by having to clean the data. Please, can we stop scribbling on the screen? All right, so that is how we implement that. Then, of course, like we said, we want to add consent forms to our survey so that people can consent to the study. To add consent forms, we can come to here to questionnaire, and then consent or assent forms, and create a form. We can choose whether we want to add a consent form for adults or for an assent form for minors. For in this case, we're going to stick with adults, and you can create default content and then edit that content by clicking this button. So it has created a default consent form based on standard guidelines, and you can edit it based on what it's specific to your survey, and you can edit it as you want and submit the informed consent form. So now our study has informed consent. We have added questions. We have added logic. We can also translate our survey into any number of languages you want. When you're doing a national survey, it is very unlikely that everybody speaks English, or very unlikely that everybody speaks that one language you want to administer the survey in. So it is always a good idea to translate your survey into other languages for the sake of inclusivity. So here, if you want to translate, you can come to this icon here that says language. You click on it, and then you select the language you want to translate to. So here, for example, I could add new languages and say, I want to translate into, for example, Afrikaans, which is the first language on the list. So it loads the survey, and I can then start translating. So here, I can then type the text into the corresponding fields here. I can also use AI to translate for me if I want to, by clicking this icon here. So AI takes this text here and populates it here. The same thing here, I can do that. And the reason why it is done one at a time is to force you to read what AI has done, so that you don't just take AI translated text and just move ahead with it. That's the reason why we didn't just put one large button that says translate, right? So that way you can translate and have the survey available in many languages. So that's how you can. I'm not going to translate all of it. This is just to show you the options available to you. Now, if you also want to administer your survey, sometimes you might want to offer incentives. Incentives are a great way to increase response rates in a survey. To offer incentives, all you need to do is come to settings here and come to incentives and payments, and you create incentives. You can create a plan which could be either raffle draw, because sometimes you don't have a lot of money, right? If you're running a survey on a very small budget, you don't have the money to give everybody payments, but you may have $10 or $20 to say, well, I'm going to have a raffle draw for one lucky winner. Even that is better than no incentive at all, because humans generally, of course, we all like to win something, right? So you can say, okay, there's one raffle draw of $20 or $50 for one lucky winner. So I can say raffle draw for one or a few, and the overall sample size for my survey is, let's say, 300 people. But like I said, I have only one raffle draw to the amount of $20, and everybody's eligible for it. So I'll save the settings. Of course, I have to pay the $20, and then the raffle draw, as the participants are taking the survey, the platform will assign one lucky person as a winner. And you can always track the disbursement from here that says disbursement history. So that's how you can administer incentives. Now, of course, like I said earlier, if you wanted to administer to everybody, well, you can also do that by selecting, payout for everybody as opposed to just raffle draws. Now, in national surveys, you also want to consider not just people who have internet, because if you're doing a web survey, what are people who don't have access to internet, who are in areas where there are no internet? You have to consider those as well. And here is where you come to offline surveys. Offline surveys allow you to launch a survey and collect data even in areas without internet. So let's say you have some research assistants. You can have them to go into those areas where there is no internet, and they can collect data on their devices. What happens is that the data are stored on their devices such that once they come back to where there is internet, the platform will automatically detect that, okay, you have internet now, and to upload the data back to the server. So you need to consider those things if your survey is truly going to be a national survey, because in every nation, there are obviously people who don't have access to internet, that people who live off the grid. How do you capture them? Well, this is the way to do that. So in this case, we'll enable offline data collection. It's enabled now, and now we can add our research assistants, put their name and their email and their email addresses. They will get a validation because, of course, the data has to be protected. They will go through, they will get a special code that allows them to set up the data collection on their devices and then to collect the data accordingly. So once you've done all of those things, it's always a good idea to preview your survey to see how participants will see it when they take it. So it's never a good idea to just rush and launch a survey without previewing it. So if we're to preview our survey, we can now see how it's going to look like to participants. This is the consent form, which we added. They can accept as the case might be. Then we have screener questions to determine eligibility. In what country do you live? So in this case here, I selected that I live in Albania and that I'm 2 years old. Obviously, I am not eligible to participate based on those inclusion criteria. So in this case, you're not the one telling participants, please just take the survey only if you live in America and you're age 18 years or older. Of course, people never listen to instructions. So when you're designing national surveys, or any survey for that matter, design it knowing fully well that people will not read your instructions. And so create a survey that does not rely on people's obedience by automating issues of logic into the survey so that it avoids you having to clean the data afterwards. So in this case here, if I were to now take the survey as somebody who's eligible, so let me take now as I live in the United States. Now I'm eligible because I said I live in the US and I'm age 61 years old. So it says, okay, you meet eligibility requirements, because eligibility requirements, whether you live in the US and you are age 18 years or older. So I can now take the survey. In the past 30 days, how many cigarettes did you smoke? See, I am literally trying to type in a letter, but it's not allowing me because I said only numbers should be allowed. So I can now type numbers here and select the units. I smoked 78 sticks, and I can now submit that response. So that way, that question prevents people from typing all manner of gibberish into the survey. The data I get are clean and perfect and ready for analysis. I don't have to do any further data cleaning. Also, I have collected data in this questionnaire on country, but in this case, my survey is not very well designed completely to wait for issues of non-response, because I only have data on age. I cannot weight the data on race. I cannot weight it on income or gender because I did not collect those variables. So you must make sure that you collect the variables you intend to weight on in the data set. But this is just for a quick demo, so it's obviously short. Now, what I want us to do is to quickly take the survey, and then we will then look at we'll now take 5 minutes to look at issues of weighting very briefly and see how we consider those things. And then we'll open up for questions. So I'm going to quickly drop the link for you to take so that we have enough responses to take the survey. Let me drop the link here. And then we'll just look at the last part of the demo, which is how do you look at issues of data weighting and data quality when you are designing surveys. So let me drop this here. So I have the link to the survey in the chat. If we can just take the survey so that we can look at how we do that quickly in a minute. Let me take that myself too. Oh, I have not launched it yet. Sorry, hold on a minute. Let me launch the survey quickly. Let me set up a timeline. I want the survey to be launched now and to end in 2026. Save. So yeah, always make sure you launch your survey clearly so you can collect data. So let me launch now. Okay, the survey has been launched now. And the inclusion criteria, you live in the US and you are aged 18 years or older, for those of us who, in case you are being kicked out by the inclusion criteria. Right, so we have the 3 responses already. We can monitor that from here. So if the final part of survey design is just looking for quality, you need to assess quality of your data, right? And there are tools to help you assess that, because it's true only that way that you can determine whether or not you need to weight the data. So to get the data itself, you can come here, this button that says data access and insights. You can come to weight data, but obviously before you rush to weight the data, you want to download the raw data set and look at it. You also want to download the clean data set. The platform automatically cleans your data for you, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up data. But if you want to, for those who would like to suffer, you can download the raw data set and clean it yourself manually too. But it's done automatically for you. But you can also look at the reports that have been generated. That will be the easier or the better way to quickly look at issues with the data before you jump into even looking at the data itself. There are many kinds of reports here. The first is the methodology report, which tells us how the study was conducted. It allows us to evaluate, issues of design and when the study was conducted. And so when we click on that, it has finished downloading it. So let's look at it quickly and grab the study report. Let me pick it up here quickly. So this is our methodology report that was just generated. The title of the survey was National Adult Tobacco Survey. This is the survey ID and everything about the basic metadata about the study. Gives us the background and motivation for the study. It tells us the study design. This was a cross-sectional design. So if we need to understand the study design or share a report of the study to individuals, we obviously don't want to reinvent the wheel. When you're designing a national survey, there are lots of things that are vying for your time. The last thing you want to do is to spend your time on mechanical tasks that don't add value to the study. So things that can be automated should be automated so that you spend your time on valuable things that require intellectual input. So for that reason, the platform automates many, many things for you so that you don't have to worry about just mechanical tasks like generating reports or things of that nature. So this is the study report. But in this case, what we need is not the methodology report, but the actual analysis report. So let's access that from here. So we can download for a subset of a population or for the whole population. Okay, that's finished. So we can just grab it from here. So it takes the data and analyzes automatically, analyzes every question and gives you the output. So let's look at that. This is how you're going to assess whether your study needs weighting or not. So this is our analysis report, same report, National Adult Tobacco Survey. This is a survey ID. This is the analyzed population is all participants, N equals 56. So we have, for each question, you have a table and a figure. So this is question 1, the table and the figure. These are the countries that participants answered from. From question 2, we have a table as well as a figure. So now, this is where you're going to start assessing for representativeness. You're going to look at the distributions for each variable. Obviously, in our questionnaire here, we didn't capture quite a lot of parameters that we need. But for each variable, you're going to start comparing the data in your data set with that from, let's say, the census. Let's say the census says, this is the distribution by, let's say, gender. But it's like, this is looking quite different from what the census says. It means that there are issues of non-response in my data set that I need to account for, right? So this is how you're going to do it. You're going to compare the distributions in your sample versus the distributions in the national or whichever parent population you sampled from. And those are the things that would inform your decision to weight. Now, if you decide to weight the data, it's very simple. There's no complication about it at all. Weighting the data simply means you'd come. Now, to weight data, you must first of all close out the survey. So because weighting means that it's a post-data collection activity. So if you try to weight the data while the survey is still active, you're going to get an error. So if you come here and say you want to weight the data, of course, it's going to give you an error. It tells you that weighting is only available once data collection is completed. And that should make sense because it's a post-data collection activity. So if you want to weight the data, we'll have to, first of all, close the survey out completely. So the project has been closed out now. Now we can weight the data. So we can now say, all right, want to weight the data. We'll come here, weight the data. Now it's going to allow us to proceed with weighting. And it says there are no weights configured yet. Of course, because we have not weighted the data yet. And it's pretty simple. Weighting is a very, very complicated task. But it's the way it's implemented on the platform is extremely, anybody can weight data now. It's completely democratized right now. You can simply say, create new calibration weights. You give the weight variable a name, and then you choose the variables to be used in creating weight. Remember, we said at the beginning that once you start your survey design, you must hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Remember, well, planning for the worst means that you include variables in your survey that might be needed to create weight. So gender, race, income, education, marital status. These are all variables, all the demographic variables that we typically weight on. For large national surveys, we typically include up to 20-something, 30-something variables in weight. So now, I'm not saying that you have to do the same, but you have to give it careful thought. It is not medicine after death when you have done everything and you realize, oops, my data quality is poor. No, it's a thought process that goes way beyond that. So, and when you're weighting, all you have to do is you select the variable. This is just a demo, doesn't match the reality, obviously, but just to demonstrate. You select the variable, which is the categories here, and from the census, you have to put in the categories that align with this. Let's pretend that this variable is gender. These are the categories of gender we have. So in our from the census, we're going to put in the percentages. And these are things we're going to go in a much deeper dive in the next sessions. We're going to take each major activity and have a deep dive into how it can be done or how it works and how to interpret it. Today was just a very, very high level. And on that note, we will stop here and take any questions that folks might have. But again, remember that the intention of today was just to give us a very, very high level picture of weights or survey design in general and how we do it in large national surveys when we conduct them. So I'm going to leave it open for questions. Questions could be about what we covered or could be about your own study that you need clarification on, and so we can address them.
I'll read earlier questions. But in the meantime, you can either post, and if you'd like to speak, you can just raise your hand. So the first one is, thank you for the immense lecture. Must we use cluster design for surveys? Are there other research designs that are applicable?
Okay, so good question. So you don't have to use cluster sampling, but that assumes that you have other options. So other options could be that one, you have a sampling frame. A sampling frame, for example, is a list of everybody who lives in that population. And so you can obviously select from that sampling frame. But when you don't have a sampling frame, well, your options are very limited. You know, in the case of large national surveys, there are very few national surveys that don't use cluster sampling because it's just the most practical thing to do. It's also very practical because when we use cluster sampling, well, most people are already inside that one cluster that we have defined. So it's easy to go and just grab all of them and go. As opposed to saying, we're going to go to one part of the country and then simple random sampling takes us to another extreme end of the country. You know, it becomes very inefficient in terms of time and resources. And so that for that reason, cluster sampling is used for its efficiency. It's not the only one, but it's the most commonly used one.
Yeah. Personally. Please unmute.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Sorry, can I talk?
Topic?
Yes. Okay.
I think there are two people talking. Maybe one person should just proceed first.
Okay.
Prof, do I have the floor? Okay.
Oh my gosh.
There's no way to determine that.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to mute everyone and I'll start.
From,
Sorry. I'll start over. Cecily, please unmute yourself. Right, I'll move to the next person for now. Bekele.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Prof, I want to appreciate you. I'm always scared to ask you questions, so I'll ask this now. We are currently working on the prevalence or epidemiology of some specific freshwater bacteria habitat around the world. And the data we have has not really been updated. So you actually did something on the Chisquares app, which I wanted to try to do, but unfortunately, I had an error logging in. And there was a part where it annotated a specific numbers of around the world. So my question is, I'm actually working on the casting of those specific organisms around the globe in the 7 continents. And but I saw it that it's a bit easier because it brought in specific number. So I don't know if the Chisquares platform have the database that it actually even did that so carefully and very clear. So I really don't know. Now, if it is possible, is it possible for me to also get those image? Like, is there a particular privilege I can download the image of those information with the exact annotation? I really don't know if you basically get what I said, Prof. So.
Yeah, so your questions are 2 questions in one that are quite different in their nature. The first question is actually the validity of what you might define as clusters. If your study population is freshwater organisms, then your population is not necessarily counties like, DeKalb County or, Lagos, a local government area. The cluster is where these organisms or study participants are found. Your study participants are found in water, So your clusters are actually bodies of water. So you can think of, oh, okay, like some lakes. So you might want to say, okay, I'm going to itemize all the lakes and sample from lakes. So that's a very important nuance I want to distinguish, right? The clusters have to be where the organisms are found. If you're saying you're going to identify clusters of fish where humans live, that may not necessarily align very well, because you are trying to study fish, not humans. If you're going to study humans, then you have to look for humans where humans are found. You're trying to study fish, then you have to look for fish where fish are found. Not you can't mix the two up. As far as the sampling, for your use case, what you might need to do is create a list of all the places where your fish are found, or the clusters. And here you will say, perform probability sampling on a sampling frame. That second option, that would trigger for the system to allow you to upload a sampling frame, and you can then choose which sampling approach you want to use, whether it's simple random or systematic sampling, or PPS sampling, which is sampling with probability proportional to size. But again, I must emphasize that it has to be apples to apples, oranges to oranges. We can't look for humans in the oceans. We have to look for humans in human settlements and look for fish in fish settlements.
Okay, if I could get you right, I'm basically working on microorganisms. So there have been specific microorganisms that have been found in those freshwater habitats around the world. So are you now saying that if I actually impute it on the system, it will definitely generate it around the world through this Chisquare platform, if I want to get you right, sir?
No. What I'm saying is that as a study investigator, it's your job. No platform, no system, no automation can solve the problem, the original problem of what is the study population. That is inherently a problem for the investigator. So there's no platform that can just say, oh, here's the study population. You have to figure that part out, right? So the platform does not exist to take away your responsibility as an author. But that once you've identified everything and created a sampling frame, then it helps you with the subsequent step. But that initial step of identifying your study population, well, oh, that, my friend, that's your job.
Oh, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
And God bless you always for us. Bye for now.
Oh, thank you very much.
Can you please show us how to reference the platform?
So when you perform a task, for example, if you perform let's say sample size calculation, let's go back to the history we had. You'd have when you click on show reference, it shows you copy citation, and the citation is there, and then you can copy it for your use case accordingly.
Thank you. Kelly?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Prof. Yeah, my question is about sample size calculation. In a situation whereby you already have a secondary data, and I want to estimate certain prevalence or any parameter or measurement like that, do I still need to, now do I have to calculate my sample size if I know that I have a large data set already for that specific investigation? That is one. And if I calculate, if possible, I calculate my sample size, can I still use a larger sample size if they are available for me in the secondary data set? That is, this is just one set of questions. The second one is that the issue of sampling, like you showed on the platform, is it possible for me to do this retrospectively if I have a secondary data set for my analysis? Thank you,
All right,
sir.
thank you. All right, thanks. So sampling and sample size calculations are not retrospectively done. So you don't get a sample and then say, oh, okay, what sample size do I need? Or you don't sample and say, okay, this is the sampling. In fact, that gives rise to biases. There's what we call the Texas sharpshooter bias. It's when you get results and then you now sample around those results that you like. And you say, oh, these are the ones that I want, right? That's bias, obviously, because that's a form of selection bias. So if you already have a fixed sample size, what you do is to say, with this sample size, what is the expected level of precision from my results? The sample size is already there. You're not calculating the sample size again to generate a new sample size. It's already a fixed data set. So you can say, with a fixed sample size, what is the expected level of precision, right? But you don't, both sample size and sampling are not things that are done retrospectively. They can only be done prospectively. All right, next question, please.
Thank you. Just to let those who are joining us for the first time know that we don't automatically get a report from Zoom. So we wouldn't know if you attended the session unless you complete the survey that I've just posted on the chat box. Please provide your name and email address. We'd also like to know your thoughts about the session. How was it? So it's basically a link to evaluate the session and for you to provide your name and email address so you can get a certificate. Thank you. Okay, the next question, Clovis.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. My name is Clovis from Nigeria, and I would like to appreciate you very much for this opportunity and the presentation. Actually, my question goes as follows. I'm conducting a research on agile leadership and on firm performance using employee engagement as a mediating variable. Now, my question goes with respect to the sampling and the questionnaire. When developing the questionnaire, how is one supposed to direct which question to be answered by the leaders of an organization or by the top managers, and what question should be answered by the employees to measure the level of engagement of the employees and that of the leaders and their interaction. So how do you set these options on ground, and how do you get your sample size? How do you get the sample for the study? Thank you very much.
All right. So the issue of how do I know which question to route people to in the survey, that's a deeply personal question. The only person who can answer that question is you as the investigator. You're the one who knows what your research question is. You're the one who knows who should answer what question. And so there's no way any other person can answer that question but you. So you need to take ownership of your study. You need to have a clear idea of what you are trying to achieve. And you need to have a clear segmentation in your questionnaire of who the primary participants are or population are, who the secondary participants or target audience are, and how you're going to route them, because that is essentially a question that only you can answer. And sample size, like we mentioned, is not quite different from what we've been doing. So you can try your hands on the platform and see what the sample size parameters are for your use case.
Very well. Thank you very much, Prof.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Prof. I really appreciate, and I am seriously following you from the last 2 weeks. I just have one question. Yes, I am a PhD student. Some instructors used the sampled population and the study population. They are the same words. In some books also, it tries to define study population and sample population is quite different. Is there any difference or any similarities?
All right. So we should try to, as much as possible, stay away from semantics as much as possible, because different fields use the same words in different ways, right? As far as we know, we understand, have a deep understanding of what we're trying to achieve, we're fine. Now, in some fields, they may call it population the study population. In some fields, they may call the analyzed population the study population. There's a lot of subjectivity, and honestly, it doesn't really matter. What you need to understand is the cycle of inference, which is the overall population, that the parent population or the target population that you wish to make inferences to. You need to understand also that if you're going to get a sample from that parent population and analyze it in your study, how are you selecting from that parent population? Every other thing is really semantics that really don't move the needle from one point to the other. And so we really wouldn't even bother about them as far as we understand the fundamental issues we're trying to talk about from first principles.
Thanks.
Okay, next question.
Veronica. Veronica, you can unmute. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Yeah, I always look forward to your lectures. Prof, the reports, like the methodology reports generated and the data analysis reports generated using the platform, do one copy it verbatim or you use your words? Will one not be accused of ethical issues using AI generated? I wanted to throw light on that, Prof.
All right, thanks. The analysis report is not generated with AI, it's just generated with algorithms. It's just pure code. So we need to understand the distinction between not all automation is AI. We've been doing automation way before AI came to the scene. So let's not conflate them.
Okay, Prof.
Then secondly, again, the goal of any data platform is not necessarily to replace you. You need to have a voice of your own and to clearly articulate your own voice. Hopefully, when you started your study, there was something you wanted to say. There's something you wanted to share with the world about your findings. So you absolutely have to say that stuff, whatever it is you wanted to say. So it may not make a whole lot of sense to just completely take what has been generated and just say, all right, here is it. Because what is missing is your voice. So the goal of any automation system should never be to replace the investigator, but to help the investigator to be able to gain more efficiencies and spend their time on things that really matter, like finding their voice. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, Prof. Yes, Prof. Prof, another question, please.
Okay.
Can this platform be used for qualitative study?
Yes, you can. It has open-ended questions, so you can collect qualitative data as well.
Okay, Prof. Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof.
And I think we should also emphasize that the class is officially over. So we typically answer questions to the very last question. So please do not feel compelled to stay should you need to leave, because our custom is to answer questions till the last question. So just as an FYI. Lungile, do we have any other questions? Are we all set?
I just want to announce that we shared a link earlier for folks to upgrade their accounts on the Chisquares platform so that they can be able to access all the features at no cost. So it wasn't working for some, it worked for some. So I'm posting it again. If it didn't work for you, please refresh your page or use another browser. You can also clear your cache. So just try those and let us know if you're still unable to use the link to gain free access to the Chisquares platform. So you first create an account, www.chisquares.com, and you use the link that I posted. That will give you free access to the account. Of course, you'll have to complete your details once you use the link, but you'll be able to follow through. Thanks. Ogo.
Yes. Great job, Israel. This is Ebuka from HSDM. Yeah, great job. And I just wanted to acknowledge the work you're doing. And hopefully we can, link up and do this on a bigger scale.
Definitely.
Great job. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the national course. I think that'll be really helpful for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, yes. All right.
Thank you.
Dr. Yao.
All right. Thank you, Prof, for the insightful presentation and the knowledge. So I just have like two questions. One is just to know if the NCHS guidelines is publicly available. Is it something that we can get access to download it for reference and also for getting more insight about the other research areas? So that's just what I want to. Then the second question is about the when you're discussing or explaining some stratification and clustering, you made mention of something around disproportionate stratified disproportionate sampling or stratified proportionate sampling. So I was just thinking around the disproportionate sampling. And what I was thinking is if it is scientifically or it is allowed to do that, this disproportionate sampling by selecting those fewer in the general population, those fewer in the population, you now give them higher percentage as opposed to those who are large. So if you do that, wouldn't that be like oversampling? And if you do that, how would that not now introduce bias in the research? So that's just what I want to understand. Or does that mean every time you do that, you also have to do weighting at the analysis stage so you can take care of the disproportionate sampling? So I just need you to just please clarify on that. And the last part is the design effect. I didn't quite get that. If the design effect is punishing the clusters for being similar or being different. So being similar within the same cluster or being different within between different clusters. And if that's the case, you increase the sample by having more than one, maybe 1.5 or 2 design effect, that will automatically increase the sample size. So increasing that sample size, we are punishing this. So that means you increase the size by also reducing the variability between the different samples. So will that now make it more like, I don't understand the punishment there, because it looks like it's not making it more normal, when you increase the sample than when you have a normal or random selection of your sample. So that's just what I want to understand about the design effect. Thank you, and over.
Okay. I really love the questions because as you're asking the questions, you're also answering them yourself. I love it. So the other question you asked, you already answered it yourself, which was the issue of, so first of all, the first question, yes, the NCHS guidelines are obviously publicly available. So if you just Google, for example, let me see if I can, if you Google NCHS suppression guidelines, that word suppression always sounds very suspicious, like, but so let me drop the link for you here right now before I forget. So let me drop to everybody. So these are guidelines. I will encourage everybody to read through this material. It provides a lot of a strong theoretical basis for how we can think through things. And in many ways, more than one, it is really compelling for every researcher to be familiar with this. And we still call this the new guidelines, even though it was 2017. So when you're reading, you see the new NCHS guidelines, don't expect anything new. It's still the old one, but it's new relative to the historical guidelines. So, so that's that. The second part of the question was about the disproportionate sampling. You've got it spot on. When you sample a larger share, it's like we're giving the small people a larger slice of the pie. Of course, that intentionally introduces bias into the study, and we have to correct for it with weight. So whenever you introduce, oversampling, you must weight the data. You must. You have no choice, because we intentionally introduce selection bias by design, knowing fully well that we will correct for it. Now, this is a problem. This is why it's a major problem when people take data from large national surveys where we did oversampling and just analyze it regularly without weighting the data. That is such a horrible mistake, because you have now baked a lot of selection bias into your study. right? So you want to weight the data. And in future sessions, like the ones we're organizing, we are going to show you how to do all of these things so that it's not like, it shouldn't be more just an intellectual exercise. You're going to have like a first-hand experience, and we're going to give you a lot of homework. How do you implement multi-stage sampling? How do you account for the bias that we have injected into each stage? How do you create weights? Because there are two types of weights you have to worry about. There are design weights. Design weights are weights we create to correct for the design. That's why they're called design weights, meaning that in the design, we intentionally injected bias into the study. So we now have to account for that, right? So the design weights are simply the inverse of the selection probability at each stage, and we'll multiply all the stages together. Don't worry, again, like I said, we're going to have series of this. That's one of the things we're planning now, where you're going to have not just the head knowledge, but how do you practically do these things? The goal is to turn everybody here into an expert in survey design so that you can actually design a whole national survey and do everything related to it just by yourself. No, you don't need to consult anybody because you have the expertise. So the bottom line, if you inject selection bias by oversampling, you must correct for it by weight. You must create design weight, and you may also have to create calibration weight. And when you have multiple weights, you multiply all of them together. Now, the last question of yours was about the design effects and why do we call it a punishing factor? So one way to think of a design effect is to think of it as a ratio of variances. What we are saying is, the design effect is the variability we will expect if our survey had been a simple random survey divided by the variability we get because our survey is not a simple random survey. We have used cluster sampling, so it's not, there's the variability we'll get, the diversity is not as much as we would get had it been a simple random survey. So the question is, how do we correct for this? Well, given the illustration I gave of a clone factor, maybe if we added more people to the survey in a cluster design, we might get more variability. So the punishment here is that we're punishing the clusters by demanding more people from them. That's a punishment because, of course, more people means more money, more resources, more everything. So that's why it's, and the punishment is not a technical term, by the way. It's just a term I used and I just made up. So if you go and start searching for punishment factor, you won't see it. But it's just a way to convey that is really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to punish the clusters for being so similar by saying, well, we're going to demand a little more from you in terms of sample size and resources. And that way, we hope that the diversity we see in this cluster will approximate what we would have seen had we used a simple random sample. But these are excellent questions, by the way.
Yeah, so that's my problem, Profs. Apologies, I still have some confusion with this. Now,
Okay.
when you increase the sample size, right? So the variability above and below the mean, that means increasing the sample size will now mean that you are the minuses and the pluses will not cancel out each other. So maybe I'm taking this from a different perspective. What I'm thinking is when you increase the sample now, that would automatically reduce the variability, right? It will reduce the variability in the case that since you have more sample size now, so it's going to cancel out each other. Now you end up with a more normal distribution of your sample. So that's just the angle I'm coming from.
I see the confusion here. You are thinking of variability in this context from a statistical perspective. We are talking about variability purely as a qualitative attribute, like the diversity of people who are in your survey. That's what we're talking about. It's not a statistical construct that we're referring to. We're saying how diverse your survey is. If you increase, of course, your diversity will be much more if you had 10 people than if you had one person. If you have one person, it's just that one guy, right? If you have more people, they're going to be more, the flavor of people you get in your survey is going to be more, right? That's what we're saying. We're not referring to a statistical attribute where we're saying the number at the top cancels out. So your confusion is applying that to some statistical parameter. No, we're not talking about statistics. We're talking about just the flavor of people you get in the sample will be more if we have more people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Can I just ask the last one? Just last question.
Sure.
So, all right. So in a population survey, right? And I deal with clusters. So we did sampling cluster sampling. So after you sample the houses where you survey, now you have a criterion that only houses that have children, for example, under 5 that you survey. Now you select 20. The design is for you to select 20 houses per cluster. So when you select the 20 houses, now you find out that only 15 out of the 20 have the eligible children. So now you are down, and you also require to have 20 per cluster, at least 20 with eligible children. So, but when you select the houses, you're selecting only that 20. Now you discovered at the end of the survey, surveying 20 households, you discover that only 15 have the exact eligible children. What do you do in that situation?
So the problem comes here in not properly defining your list of frame at the beginning. Your frame is not just, this is exactly the question the first individual asked, but just cast in a different way, where we're trying to find clusters of fish where humans dwell. So we have to find clusters of people with children where people with children dwell. So not every cluster meets your criteria. So what you will do here in this case, for example, is let's say let's say you're working with a cluster. For simplicity, let's say a cluster is a street. You have 3 streets and you want to sample individuals or households with children. Your first task is to identify the houses that have children on those streets. So it might be, okay, we're going to do a rapid fire quick assessment on this street. Is there a child here? Is there a child here? Okay, there's a child here. Okay, house number 5 has a child. It's part of a sampling frame. And then you continue. And after you've mapped it out, then you can then sample from those houses. So it's not as if you're sampling empty clusters, but actual clusters that meet the study's inclusion criteria.
Thank you, sir. That made a lot of sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is it ethically acceptable to use AI tools to generate research questionnaires? If so, what guidelines should researchers follow to ensure that the quality and validity of AI generated questions?
The real issue should not be whether one can, or it's like, to what extent the AI can, no AI tool or no automation can replace or should replace a human, right? So the question is, to what extent are you using the AI tool? Like, how is it replacing you? So in other words, if we took you out of a picture, do we still have a study? Well, if we have a study independent of you, then we have a problem, right? So AI is a tool. A tool is, meant to help increase our efficiency and our productivity. Nobody here expects you that if you are given a data set, nobody expects you to whip out your fingers and toes and start counting 1, 2, 3 with your toes. Of course, we'll expect you to use statistical software because there's an acceptance that software is good. It increases productivity. The same thing applies to AI. You should absolutely use AI, but the AI is not meant to replace you. So if you use AI to generate a research question, are you refining the question? AI cannot know the context for your study, right? AI knows everything, but AI cannot know the context in which your study is cited. So are you adding context to that study? If you're not doing anything, then you're not even doing your job as a researcher, because AI suggestion without context is useless. We need to have context for which the study is located. So remember the PICO framework, the P is population. You need to streamline that context for the population to your study, as well as other elements of PICO, really. So is it okay to use AI? Of course, you should use AI. And that's an entirely personal decision. And here is the kicker, right? The good news is that nobody's forcing you to use AI too, right? You can choose to say, I don't want to use AI, and that is completely fine too. But should you use AI, then you want to make sure that you add the context that is required. But AI use in of itself is not unethical. Using AI and then claiming you do not use it is unethical, because that is outright lying, right? So if you use AI, and many people are also asking, oh, how do I humanize my AI, which is like another word for it is, I want to make sure other people don't know I used AI. Well, now you're veering into the terrain of poor ethics, because you're trying. If you were asked most likely that, oh, did you use AI? You are very likely to say no, which in of itself is unethical at that point. So AI use in of itself is not unethical, but there are lots of shady ways you can do it that then makes it look very questionable.
I think that's all. Any last minute questions? I'm tempted to pick on Diane. Any last minute question?
I'm done.
Thank you. Sorry, I just love seeing new people at our sessions. Thank you so much, everyone. Where's Dr. Annie? I think she's gone. Thank you so much. I believe that's all. Any last words from you, Prof?
No last words.
Okay.
Yeah, not enough talking.
Well, we hope you did very well. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you in our future sessions, and we hope you've completed the survey, especially providing information, your suggestions for topics that you'd like to see us discussing in the future. I will also share our LinkedIn. I'm sure you all received those, but I'll still share them right here on the chat box. Please follow us on LinkedIn. We normally share our slides on LinkedIn and our recordings via YouTube. So please do follow us and just stay connected. We appreciate you all for joining us. Stop recording.
All right. Thanks,